Regn. This is an Old English word that happens to very closely resemble its modern English equivalent, although Old English spelling conventions make that less than obvious, as you'll see if you look at the title. If you've watched these videos before, you might know that there are lots of good reasons for thinking that when Old English speakers wrote G next to a front vowel like I, U, E or A, it was often pronounced like a Y, hence Regn. All my life I've lived in England, so almost 100% of the times I've experienced rain it's been English rain, and this is one of those experiences that I feel connects me to the distant past. The visceral experience of standing outside in the rain has been the same throughout my life, and it stands to reason that it was probably the same 1,000 years ago. And then I went to Czechia on holiday in 2018, which is the only Slavic-speaking country I've ever been to, incidentally, and on the first day we arrived, we walked down a narrow street in Prague and it started raining. And the rain was so different to what I was used to that I was actually startled. For one thing, I remember the raindrops being huge. Rather than just feeling like cold little needles, it felt like actual ball-shaped droplets were hitting me, and I seem to remember thinking that the water was actually warm. And obviously it couldn't have been warmer than my body temperature, but as it soaked into my clothes, I felt that it was actually sort of warm rather than cold. And it was at that point that I realised the experience of being rained on can be different to how I'd experienced it in the past. These things are filtered through culture, so depending on how and where you were raised, you might view rain as bad weather which stops you going out, or a much needed thing that stops your crops failing, or something that's refreshing after a really hot, humid day or week. And these things are also filtered through your emotional associations, and emotions themselves are culturally constructed. In fact, I think there is no emotion at all that's not heavily culturally conditioned, no matter how strongly we might feel it within ourselves. A lot's been written on early medieval English attitudes to water, although mostly bodies of water rather than rain. Archaeology can tell us how people behaved in relation to bodies of water, and literature can tell us a bit about how they thought about them. A couple of literary references to bodies of water from the early medieval period have them as places where monsters live. So, Sarah Semple points to Maxims 2, a document that goes through various truisms about the world, and one of these is that Thurs shall on fenne jewunion, arna innan lande. A monster has to live in the fen, alone in his land. Going by the other things written in Maxims 2, it seems like the author considers this a statement that's just true about the world, maybe even something nobody would question. But even though we're being told this by an early medieval writer in their own words, we'll still interpret it through our own lens. How you translate the word thurs will massively impact how a modern reader understands this maxim. Do you translate it as monster or giant or boggart or ghost? You know, all of these words have their own semantic fields in our minds, ranges of things that we can acceptably use the word to describe. An Old English speaker's semantic field for the word thurs probably doesn't align very well with any of our modern semantic fields relating to these words. It's just a word that doesn't exist anymore and doesn't really communicate much to us beyond maybe scary living thing that should be avoided. There's a bit of debate within early medieval archaeology about whether certain objects people left at the sides of bodies of water were votive deposits that were put there to achieve an interaction with something that we'd see as supernatural. So a sword left for whatever lives under the water, or a brooch to be picked up by a god walking past, or something like that. Obviously the exact nature of the supernatural thing is completely unclear, but you know, the suggestion is that they're left there for something that we might see as supernatural. On the other hand, many archaeologists view these objects as just things that people dropped on their way from point A to point B. I'll put some links to specific sites in the description. I've talked in the past about the problems of interpreting early medieval behaviour as either practical or spiritual. Which one of these options you think is most likely massively depends on intuition you have, which might not reflect early medieval behaviour. It's easy to take generalised views of humans in the past, like they believed in all sorts of nonsense, or they were very spiritual people, or they were very practical people. An assessment of modern cultures shows a startling range of behaviours, from behaviour that's completely intuitive and understandable to a modern person, a Western person I should say, to behaviour that's difficult for us to wrap our heads around. Jill Frederick, in a book that I'll link in the description, points out that most major references to water in early medieval English literature depict it as scary or dangerous, but it would be reductive to flatten early medieval attitudes to water to just negative ones. Bodies of water are obviously useful. The archaeological record suggests that people made good use of water birds and fish as food and things like that. Birds are another aspect of the environment that I look at and think that they must have been more or less the same 1,000 years ago as they are now. Of course, the range of species that lived in the UK was slightly different. Increasingly in my neighbourhood now, there are parakeets, which there weren't even 5 years ago, and many of you from the UK will have noticed that kites are everywhere all of a sudden, and they've displaced a lot of the buzzards. But the experience of watching an individual bird live out its behaviour must be very similar to the same experience 1,000 years ago. Well, first of all, again, that's not necessarily completely true. My partner pointed out to me that birds that live in cities behave slightly differently to birds that live in rural areas. They make louder vocalizations and eat different things. But if we assume that birds broadly behave the same way now as they did in the year 800, in terms of head movements and the way they walk and fly and interact with each other, that gives us a bit of scope to think about something interesting. Even though the sight of these birds is completely natural to me, and would presumably be completely natural to an early medieval person if you ignore the modern bird feeders, we still wouldn't think about them in the exact same way. I'm not having an early medieval experience by looking at these birds, I'm having a modern experience. Every experience I have is modern. When I look at the bird, what thoughts does it trigger in me? I might remember the David Attenborough documentary I watched recently and think about how their behaviour is so complex and about how they relate to dinosaurs. I might think about memories I have of those birds in my grandparents' garden and how my granda has these big RSPB posters that tell him what species certain birds are, but the ink on the poster has faded, so it's not always obvious what colour the birds on the poster are meant to be. I think of birds as things that exist outdoors, so if you encountered a bird in your house it would be very surprising. I think of birds as something that I don't really interact with. You know, they'll react if I shout at them, but I don't touch them, I don't use them for anything. I think they're nice, but it's not really existentially important to me whether certain species are in my neighbourhood or not. Having been in reconstructions of early medieval houses, which obviously doesn't make me an authority on early medieval houses, but it's, you know, maybe one anecdotal data point for you. Birds aren't as avoidant of going inside those houses as they are of going inside modern houses. Owls roost at the ends of the roofs, and you can find owl pellets at the edges of the floor, sometimes with mashed up mice in them. Early medieval people in Britain hunted a wider range of birds for food, and they were certainly more of a resource than I see them as. And people who work outdoors most of the time get a sense for how certain bird species behave, at least in my experience. Robins are solitary and they follow people around, especially in autumn and winter. Sparrows travel around in groups and peck at seeds en masse. Cormorants sit on islands in the middle of lakes and don't move very much. Grebes dive underwater and you don't know where they'll pop up again. Crows pester things apparently just for fun. Seagulls and kites swarm over fields where the animals are being disturbed, or maybe kites don't swarm, but I see quite a lot of them nowadays over fields, like five or six over the same field sometimes, which is not something I would have seen 5 years ago. If you're working outdoors constantly, you might have an even clearer picture of the differences between bird species. You know, how they behave at different times of year, what kind of behaviour is unusual for a certain type of bird. And as an early medieval person, you'd have your own memories of sparrows and pigeons from when you were younger. How you taxonomise birds will depend on your culture. If you speak a language that doesn't distinguish between pigeons and doves, you might consider them to be variations of the same thing. If you speak a language that does distinguish them from each other, you might have different connotations to you. So for me, collared doves are kind of nice, whereas feral pigeons are viewed as vermin. I don't obviously think of them as disgusting or anything like that, but there's just this cultural perception that they're, the whole rats in the street kind of thing. A PhD thesis by Mohammed Eric Rahman Lacey, which I hope I pronounced right, examines the lens through which Old English writers saw birds. He describes ways that etymology can shed light on how people understood birds. The Old English word for hawk, havuk, comes from an Indo-European root meaning take or capture. Historical semantics doesn't allow us to be very exact about what this root meant by the time the word havuk started referring to the bird, but it does give us a tantalising glimpse of understanding. And that's not surprising. Why wouldn't an Old English speaker know that, how these birds hunted, or that they were birds of prey? Of course they would know. It'd be pretty shocking if they didn't know. But I think it's very interesting to see hints of that understanding through the etymology of words. Although I think it's also important not to overstate the power of etymology when making inferences about how ancient people thought. Lacey touches on a point similar to the one I made about pigeons and doves. Not only do some languages categorise birds differently, Spanish has all of these as palomas, whereas English separates them into pigeons and doves, but in a language like Old English that didn't have a standard dictionary or anything like that, the exact range of things that a word referred to might have differed from place to place quite a lot. Modern scholars have argued about exactly what species Old English writers were referring to when they used certain words. So the word stauren is sometimes interpreted as meaning turn, but Margaret Goldsmith argues that the way Old English writers describe the behaviour of the stauren doesn't match up with the behaviour of terns at all, and that word might refer to kittiwakes. Lacey's dissertation goes into an interesting analysis of whether the Old English word hrefn just referred to ravens at the time, or whether it refers to ravens, crows and rooks. And then he goes on to do the same thing with a few other species of bird mentioned in Old English literature. He focuses a bit on the word ūle, which meant owl. There are 5 species of owl native to Britain nowadays, all with different behaviour. I personally think the barn owl is the one early medieval English speakers would probably have been most intimately familiar with, because if reconstructions are anything to go by, it would happily have lived in an early medieval house. It was a barn owl that was living in the reconstructed house I mentioned earlier. In fairness, that house wasn't actually lived in, so maybe a barn owl would be more cautious about living in a house with people in it. But if the behaviour of modern barn owls is anything to go by, it would happily have lived in outbuildings and things. As far as I can think, it probably would have been useful to have around because it eats rodents and it's not big enough to bother livestock. But obviously that's just my modern intuition, that might not be right. Other owls probably would have been more distant, so I hear a lot of tawny owls in the woods near where I live at night. I've seen one flying overhead, but they're normally kind of hidden. But again, the commonness of tawny owls might be a modern thing. These birds can change in numbers very dramatically in a very short period of time. Lacey points out that scholars of medieval literature have argued about the meanings of 2 terms in particular, ūle and huve. A lot of medieval literature comes with Latin glosses, which are translations of a word into Church Latin, and this helps us to work out what words meant, because then we have a Latin word to kind of triangulate the meaning a little bit. The huve is usually glossed using a Latin word that means eagle owl, and it's sometimes glossed using a Latin word that just means large birds of prey in general. On the other hand, ūle is glossed using various different Latin words referring to smaller owl species. So is it that early medieval English people considered large birds of prey, including eagle owls, to be part of one group, and smaller owls to be part of another group? Lacey points out that eagle owls don't exist natively in modern Britain, and although they were definitely here at some point, a lack of archaeological evidence suggests that they might have become extinct in Britain before the early medieval period, although, as he says, they tend to live in mountains and areas where things don't preserve very well anyway, so it's possible they existed but were rare or restricted to certain areas. One author suggests that huve referred to the long-eared owl, and that Old English writers were just glossing using the closest thing to the Latin term that they could find. After all, huve more closely resembles the sound made by long-eared owls, and ūle more closely resembles the sound made by tawny owls, for example. Another complication Lacey mentions is people's awareness of these species. It's clear nowadays that these sounds are made by tawny owls because you can look up tawny owl noise on YouTube and you get this sound. But even if early medieval people were aware of tawny owls because they'd found them roosting during the day or come across dead ones from time to time, they wouldn't necessarily have been able to make that connection. That this is the bird that's been making that noise, especially if they lived in an area where there weren't that many tawny owls. On the other hand, maybe it was obvious to them what was making these noises. Just another thing about their awareness that we can't really intuit. I hope this meandering video has been interesting. I hope Dr. Lacey doesn't mind me talking through some of his PhD thesis, and I'd more than encourage everyone to read the rest of it using the link in the description. And I hope this meandering video was an interesting one and wasn't too unstructured. I'm happy to take people's advice on whether they want more things like this or less things like this. But yeah, I will talk to you very soon with a more structured video, and I thank everyone very much for watching.